Well, good afternoon. It's been a long but a full day, and hope we can finish strong here these last couple talks, so hang with us. 13 years ago, I went to pastor a Southern Baptist church with 30 elderly members. And it was a church that was in financial shambles, and it was about 2 to 3 years from closing. They hired me at a salary that I found out later they couldn't pay me longer than 6 months. Of course, I found that out after I got there. There were 3 different efforts to get me fired in the first 5 years at the church. The first attempt, 3 short months into my ministry, so I didn't have a honeymoon. I'm not sure what that is in regard to ministry. The first one came at 3 short months into my ministry, where there was a staff member that I inherited who boasted of getting my predecessor fired and then tried to do the same with me just 3 months in. The second firing attempt happened at about year 2.5. I mentioned the membership issue that came up. Well, there was a lot that happened after that, 2.5 years. And then the third attempted firing happened at year 5, which almost split the church. And it ultimately led to 25% of the congregation leaving. And many folks even left who had come in the last 5 years, who had become friends and had been poisoned by those who had turned. So when all the smoke cleared after those 5 years, I was, needless to say, beat up. I was discouraged. And honestly, I was ready to leave after that. And when I get asked a lot why I stayed, and I look back and I see 2 reasons why I stayed. The first one is kind of a morbid curiosity. I couldn't imagine God taking us through what he did the first 5 years and just abandon us. So there was a strange desire to want to see what was coming next. But there's a second reason. I was haunted by the words of Hebrews 13:17. And the reason I stayed is because I was haunted by them. I don't think I would have stayed otherwise. And I realized that I would give an account for the souls under my care, and here's the key. Even those sheep who didn't like me very much, I will give an account for. And so I stayed. And what's interesting is that some of them stayed also. And by God's grace, the ship turned in year 6, right after that. And several of those people who were after me in those first 5 years many of those relationships have been redeemed. And some of them are still at the church, and I have they are warm, loyal supporters of me now, 13 years into this. Now, as you can imagine, there's a lot to that story that I just summarized real quickly. And I don't have time to get into that today. But I stayed after those 5 brutal years, and I realized I'd learned some amazing lessons in those first 5 years that I'm convinced I would not have learned if I would have left at year 5, like I almost did. Here's why I bring this, why I share just a small summary of my story on this particular topic that we're going to look at. The first firing attempt that I had to deal with was a staff member who wanted the authority of being a pastor, was not one, and was not willing to submit to my authority as a pastor. The second and third firing attempts came at the hands of some of my deacons who function in a very typical kind of old school Southern Baptist church where the deacons are pseudo-elders but do not qualify as elders, and many of them even not biblically qualifying as deacons either. So I want to share with you a few lessons on leadership I was able to learn as I look back after those 5 years that I believe might be helpful to you as you think about raising up and finding elders and deacons in your church when you don't have any. So I want to give you 5 ways to raise up biblically qualified elders and deacons. 5 ways to raise up biblically qualified elders and deacons when there are none, and I want to add this to it, that hopefully might keep you from getting fired. It's an important tag, I think, in this conversation. We're going to be realistic about it. So 5 ways to raise up biblically qualified elders and deacons when there are none that will hopefully keep you from getting fired. Take your Bible, if you haven't, turn to 1 Peter chapter 5. I assume many of you will be familiar with this passage. Apostle Peter exhorts elders, pastors, and says this, first 4 verses of chapter 5. Therefore I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Now, I want that to be a backdrop as we look at these 5 ways you can raise up elders and deacons, biblically qualified elders and deacons. I want to stress that because some of us have elders in the church that aren't biblically qualified or deacons that don't qualify. So I want to focus on how to raise up biblically qualified elders and deacons. Obviously, my experience is from a revitalization perspective, but I'm hopeful that these 5 ways will also apply to you planters as well. So number 1, work with what you have. Work with what you have. I had a young seminarian come into my office about 6 months into my pastorate there, really disturbed because he had discovered that several of the deacons in our church were tied to the Masons. Now, my church, like many Southern Baptist churches, the World War II generation saw 3 things as coexisting and equally important, and that was being a Christian, American, many of them vets from the war, and being a part of the Masons in some way. And he came to me insisting that this was a huge problem, and again, there's troubling things that I'm not going to talk more about with this, but he came in at this moment, so this is a huge problem, and we need to discipline these deacons. And I restated his suggestion back to him just so he could hear it, and I said, so 6 months into my ministry here, you want me to do that's never been done in the 85-year history of this church, and that's discipline someone, let alone discipline deacons who function as pseudo elders who think what you want to discipline them for is a virtue, not a heresy. So I just told him I was not going to take his suggestion 6 months into my ministry there. Not because I wasn't troubled by it, also because that was going to be a very unwise thing to try to do 6 months in. Yet this young brother, he showed his teachability, his willingness to grow out of this by becoming one of the first elders that we affirmed in our congregation 5 years later. The deacon that led the 3rd firing attempt that almost split the church, he's still at the church today. He's in his 80s. He still serves as a deacon. And we actually have a very warm relationship with one another. And this is just one of several relationships in the church that God redeemed as we just tried to figure out how to love each other through all these struggles and fights. But I have to say, one of the sweetest things I experienced 13 years later, and it happened Sunday, is to walk in on Sunday and have that man come to me with a warm smile and hug me and tell me that he loves me. It's hard to just put words to describe what that means when that was the man who went after me years ago. Here's my point. So many pastors want to go in and they see the mess and they want to clean house and start over. I mean, let's be honest, church planners, isn't part of the temptation to plan, that's one of the perks. You get to start over with leadership when you plant. But you need to know God may want to use you and your ministry to reach and disciple men in your church that you already have who might be your future elders and your future deacons, as these 2 men were in my church. And by the way, planters are not exempt from this lesson. I know plenty of planters who got to handpick their team to go plant, and 3 years in, they were regretting somebody they chose on their team. So planters, this is for you too. You work with what you have. Number 2, teach on distinctions between the two offices. The office of pastor, elder, same office. We want to make sure we make that distinction today. The office of pastor, elder, and deacon. And there are many similarities biblically between the godly character and qualities of elders and deacons. When we read 1 Timothy chapter 3, there's a lot of similarities. What's typically the problem I have found in my church and many other kinds of churches that are trying to distinguish these offices is nobody knows what the distinctions are. So I want to give you 3 categories of distinctions. Again, the similarities I think are easier to see in the godly character and qualities of 1 Timothy 3. Here are 3 distinctions. The first one is teaching versus well-taught. Teaching versus well-taught. We're not going to take time to do it. If we looked at 1 Timothy chapter 3, we would see that the list of qualifications of both of these offices. There is one important distinction out of them all that separates a pastor from a deacon, and that is being able to teach. An elder must be, as Paul wrote to Titus, gifted to exhort in sound doctrine and able to refute those who contradict it. So teaching versus well-taught. Here's the second distinction. Oversight versus service. Look down at 1 Peter chapter 5. Peter makes it clear the role of an elder is exercising oversight, and then you notice he explains what that means and what that looks like, the manner of doing that. There's also authority implied in what Peter talks about here with the elders, explaining how to show oversight. Deacons serve under the oversight and authority of the elders, and that's an important distinction. Third one, shepherding versus practical doing. Shepherding versus practical doing. Again, looking at 1 Peter 5, Peter makes it clear the role of an elder is to shepherd the flock. Deacons may be involved in the spiritual care of members. That certainly does happen, and I think that's good when it does. But Peter only exhorts the elders to shepherd, and they shepherd on behalf of the chief shepherd. The elders have the authority from Christ to shepherd the people, not the deacons. And one of the problems that I see in dying churches, as well as some church plants, is these distinctions are not made clear. And when those distinctions are not made clear, the power struggles exist without clear lines in the sand of who is responsible to do what. But when elders and deacons, when they both know their biblical role, when qualified people serve as deacons and elders, it is one of the most beautiful designs of God you will ever see. And those who have seen it know what I'm talking about. Number 3, pray and wait for God to raise up leaders. Pray and wait for God to raise up leaders. So I watch a lot of young guys who come out of seminary, read the Deliberate Church, and they will wave the banner to say, yes, I believe God's word builds the church, and I'm going to just go and preach. And that's important because do you realize the most important thing, we talk about change and how fast and what we're supposed to do with all of that. The most important thing that needs to change in a church, typically that's of a dying church, changes immediately when you become the pastor. And that's what's preached from the pulpit every week. The most important thing changes immediately. And yet it's amazing, 6 months in, I find many young pastors, when I talk with them, just frustrated. They're frustrated about how it's going and what's happening. Why is that? Well, there's obviously many reasons. There's many things to get frustrated in early in a pastorate, but I think here's something at the root of it. I don't think some pastors really believe what they say they believe. I think some pastors don't believe the word really does build the church like they always said that they believed. now that they're in the trench preaching and having to back up what they have always said. Because if they did, I think there would be more of a tendency to simply preach and pray and wait. But months in, there's impatience. And I think the same thing happens with leadership. We'll say, well, God will raise up leaders in his time for our church. We get impatient because we want them now. It's one of the quickest things we realize when we go into a church we need the most. When we feel isolated and we feel alone and everybody's coming after us and no one else, because you're it. The reality is with revitalization, brothers, is there may be a time you got to go in by yourself and just slug it out for a while on your own in that church until God brings leaders as you preach and give a regular, steady diet of the word to the congregation, which is why it's so important to have fellowship with other pastors. So I think it's a real gift that Kevin Smith is here, that 9 Marks and NAM are doing this together. These are organizations that are meant to serve pastors, particularly those who feel in isolation and are alone and feel they have nobody. So let me just encourage you during breaks or even when this is over, touch base with some of these groups that have been mentioned, these individuals. They want to serve you in that way because you probably will have to slug it out for a while on your own until God raises those leaders up. Patience and prayer and believing in them both will keep your sanity. And it will keep you, hopefully, from making bad decisions out of impatience that will cause unnecessary problems in your church in the early years. Do you really trust that God's word is powerful enough to build your church? That's a really, really important question for every single one of you to answer on your own. Because we're at a 9 Marks conference with NAM, we're all going to affirm that, I assume. But do we really believe it? And do we believe it in the way that we're trusting in what's being preached and how God is going to work in his time? And if you really believe that, do you really believe that God will raise up elders and deacons in your midst? Did you know that God knows you need them? This is God's design. He knows you need elders and he knows you need deacons. Ask him for them. And wait and be patient for him to work in his time as you preach and as you love people. So preach your heart out. Tenaciously love your people and wait. Number 4 way we raise up elders and deacons. Look for pastors and deacons who may already exist. Look for pastors and deacons who may already exist. Some of the best advice I've heard on this issue, I heard a long time ago. I was reflecting just memories and being here, that I met Mark when I was 22 years old, and I'm 42 now. And this is some of the best advice I ever heard from Mark. He said, you find your future elders by looking at the men who act like elders, do the work of an elder. People look at him as an elder, but he does not seek the title, the pay, or the recognition of an elder. That's how you find your future leaders. And man, that advice has been so sound for me as I've tried to find elders and deacons in my church. See, my experience has shown me a shepherd, a true shepherd, gifted and called by God, has a shepherd's heart. And a shepherd who has a shepherd's heart can't help himself but shepherd people. A shepherd's heart does not magically appear with an MDiv, an 80K salary, and the title of senior pastor. Shepherd is called by God to shepherd, and they can't do anything else. So look for the men who appear to have shepherding gifts in your church, and they may not even know it. They're just doing what out of impulse because they love Jesus and love people and want to care for them. Look for those men. And realize it may be one of the roughest person in your church. It may be somebody you hadn't even thought about yet. But I want you to know, I would rather work with a man who loves Jesus and loves his word and is good with people and maybe a train wreck in so many other ways of his life. I'd rather work with that man 10 out of 10 times versus the arrogant, unteachable, gifted guy who has figured it all out already. The longer I pastor, the longer I raise up leaders in different ministry settings, the more and more I value humility and teachability before I value gifts and abilities. Number 5, last one. Recruit qualified men to serve. Recruit qualified men to serve. Parentheses, eventually. This may not be something you do right away, but this is something that you may have to do to bring in these leaders. Sometimes we have to go outside our own church to find other qualified men to serve as an elder alongside us. So I ended up bringing a friend with me to Auburndale 13 years ago. His name is Mike. Mike was a truck driver. He had a high school education. He was self-taught, preacher and teacher of the word, really gifted at it. He was actually my Sunday school teacher in the previous church that we were in. He was very solid theologically. He loved people. He was great with people. And it ended up being a good partnership because Mike he was starting to test his gifts and think through ministry. So he needed ministry experience, and I just happened to need a 6'5", 300-pound man to come partner with me in this hard work. So it worked out. And Mike came and was there 4 years and slugged it out with me in 4 of the hardest years of my life. And I always had him there with me. And I'm not sure I would have survived without him there. And by the time he left 4 years into our time there at the church, by the way, there were no other qualified men in the church, not even close, to serve in this way. But by the time Mike left, there were 3 other men who had qualified as elders over that 4-year period that had come to the church and had been raised up. And those 3 other elders came on as elders when Mike left. And one of the reasons that was helpful was because people understood what a pastor was because Mike played that role of associate pastor. And these 3 men came in, and we spread that shepherding role to these other 3 men, and the church understood that. Which, by the way, I want to say in Southern Baptist contexts, to be very careful on your terminology in so many ways. One of the reasons I almost split the church in year 5 is because people didn't understand what an elder was. And it doesn't matter how much you talk to them about what an elder is and show them history books. I'll never forget the elderly widow I went to and tried to show in the history book that there's elders. She was 90 and she said, "Sonny, don't tell me about history." So I didn't anymore after that. Southern Baptists understand what a pastor is. And they didn't understand what an elder is. I don't give a rip about terminology. I want the functionality of the office in the church. And I would encourage you to pursue that and be sensitive to know how your people can understand what you're wanting to move to and what these roles are. So if you're a pastor of a struggling church and you have no one to serve with you, that is a lonely place. It just is. It's okay to acknowledge that. Put out feelers around you in your area to see if there might be somebody who wants to test their gifts for ministry and maybe is up for an adventure with you. And again, use these organizations, these men who have networks like Kevin Smith and NAM and Nine Marks and others who can point you to other pastors to lock arms with. And see if there's somebody out there who maybe wants an adventure. Church planners typically send a team out. And I would argue for someone who goes into a dying church, there's just as much of a need to have some kind of team there also. Oftentimes it's not the case, which is one of the reasons I'm really excited about what NAM is doing with church revitalization. They're wanting to send teams to help with this work just like they do planting. And these brothers are here to talk to you as well if you have questions. So go look in your area to see if there's anybody who is up for an adventure. Tell them, you can't promise them a salary. You can't promise them a ministry title or a position at first. But I think you can safely promise them, if your church is anything like my church at all, there will be few dull moments in the early years of your church. You may never know who you might draw in for that. It's invaluable to have someone, at least one person, to walk through it with you. So the theme of all this, these 5 lessons, is I think there's plenty we can do intentionally leading and shepherding our church to find and raise up biblically qualified elders and deacons in our church in a way, hopefully, that won't get us fired. But ultimately, even though there's plenty to do, God is the one that ultimately provides the leaders. He knows you need them. So preach and shepherd your people and pray and wait. And in doing that, you ultimately will have all you need for God to provide what you need in His time. He knows what you need. Brothers, be faithful to the task you know you're called to as you wait for Him to raise those leaders up. Amen.